Tucker Carlson recently did a very interesting segment where he talked about both securing the southern border and his opposition towards U.S. military interventionism. Now, I'm going to show you guys this entire video, but I want you guys to understand the beginning is going to be the very typical far right-wing agenda where he talks about why we need to secure the southern border and why there's this crisis going on. But I really want you to focus on the latter 3 minutes of this video, because he does actually a really good job of capturing why we should not be conducting so much military intervention in various countries. Take a look at this video.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Here's a helpful hint about how your government works. We're full of helpful hints on the show. If you ever see consensus forming in Washington, run. Something awful is about to happen. For decades, you'll remember, there was total consensus that our trade deals could not be better. They helped everyone. Meanwhile, as they were telling us that, America's manufacturing sector died, and huge parts of the middle class died along with it. Then there was bipartisan consensus on the Iraq War and the stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction we'd supposedly find there, but didn't. A few years later, there was consensus on banking regulations. That was just before the financial crisis hit. Then there was still more consensus on the creation of an all-seeing surveillance state that was supposed to somehow help you, but that is now scanning your face and reading your texts. There wasn't much debate in Washington about any of those policies. There should have been. So it's with some skepticism that we note a new consensus forming here, this one about our southern border. It may look bad down there, they're telling us, but calm down. It's fine. Everything's just fine. That's the new word from Max Boot. Boot is a columnist for Jeff Bezos' newspaper, but more than that, Boot is the living repository of every warmed-over cliche, every silly half-truth, every stale scrap of stupid conventional wisdom the buffoons who run this place have thought up recently. So here's the latest. This is from Boot's appearance on CNN last night.
I'm ready to declare a national emergency. The national emergency is not on the southern border. It's in Washington, D.C., with a president who is lawless and out of control.
Who is this guy? Well, Max Boot calls himself a foreign policy expert. That's a title that doesn't actually mean anything, but in practice, it allows Boot to agitate for more counterproductive foreign wars. In the years since 9/11, Max Boot has demanded military intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Iran, and North Korea, and likely many other places. He's called for the U.S. to topple the Saudi monarchy. And of course, like so many neocons, Boot fell headlong into the Russia conspiracy nuttiness for more than 2 excruciating years. It's hard to think of anyone in this country more discredited than Max Boot. Going to him for foreign policy advice is like giving Jeffrey Dahmer a cooking show. He'd be the last person you would ask. So, of course, Max Boot now has gigs at CNN, The Washington Post, and the Council on Foreign Relations, because that's how Washington really works. The key is never apologize, never admit fault, no matter what. Watch Max Boot explain that the idea of toppling the Libyan government, which was deranged, was in fact brilliant. We just didn't do it right.
We did a great job of overthrowing Gaddafi, but did nothing to secure the country afterwards. And there was, I might add, a similar lack of planning for our pullout in the case of Iraq, where there was very little sense of what would happen after U.S. troops left in 2010. We can't think about these as being kind of quick in and out engagements. We send some troops, kill some people, and then come back home to a victory parade. Sadly, it doesn't work that way.
Boot didn't explain how exactly it does work. He didn't need to explain. Everyone knows his assumption. It's the same as permanent Washington's core assumption. Military occupation is always the right answer, no matter what the question is. Sending somebody else's kids to a foreign country is always and everywhere the right thing to do. When Donald Trump pledged to pull Americans out of Syria, Max Boot went crazy, just on principle, because no troops can ever leave, ever.
There is nobody who knows anything about the situation in Syria who recommends doing this. This is a Christmas gift to America's enemies. This will help ISIS, this will help Russia, this will help Iran, this will help Bashar Assad, and this will hurt Israel and our Kurdish allies.
What did Max Boot not say? What do you notice about that? Well, he never explained how keeping Americans in Syria would help the United States. Why didn't he mention it? Because he doesn't care. Nobody in Washington cares. And maybe that's why you never hear anyone ask questions about our current military commitments. Are we overextended, perhaps? Well, here are the numbers. As of tonight, we have nearly 175,000 active duty personnel serving overseas. American troops are posted in 158 different countries. For perspective, there are only 195 countries total on the entire planet. We're almost everywhere. This map might give you a sense of the scale of it. Keep in mind, there is no world war currently in progress. This is what we've signed up for in peacetime. And yet you may notice that there is one place American troops are not. They are not on our southern border protecting us. They should be. We could use them. Tens of millions of illegal immigrants already live here in the United States. We don't know the exact number. We don't even know who they are. They just show up. And 100,000 more are showing up every month. Over time, this is how countries collapse. Max Boot doesn't think that's a crisis. Nobody in Washington thinks it's a crisis. As far as they're concerned, illegal immigration is just some right-wing talking point that Trump throws to his base at rallies in Grand Rapids. You know what they think is a crisis? You know what they're really concerned about? Medical care in Morocco. That's a problem we must solve immediately. Luckily, we have Exercise African Lion. Never heard of it? You're paying for it. In the last year, 1,100 U.S. military personnel have participated in that exercise, all of them working to make Morocco healthier. Or how about the plight of the Ethiopian Navy? The Ethiopian Navy needs a lot of help considering that Ethiopia is entirely landlocked as a country. Thank heaven for our 6th Fleet. They're on it. The Navy just sent out a press release last week bragging about new talks with the Ethiopian government to, quote, discuss the exciting task of building the Ethiopian Navy. Feel safer? The people of Mozambique feel safer. U.S. military aircraft have flown 60 missions. They transported more than 6,300 metric tons of relief supplies in there in the wake of a cyclone. That was nice. In Honduras, where we currently have 400 American troops stationed, our 612th Air Base Squadron recently helped extinguish a wildfire in a small city called Comayagua. In Malaysia, meanwhile, a U.S. Navy amphibious construction battalion is rebuilding water tanks at an elementary school. And we could go on and on. Now, these are all good works, virtuous things, done at taxpayer expense by the most altruistic country in the history of the world. That's us, the United States. But what about us? What about our country? We're being invaded. No offense to the Ethiopian Navy.
I'm actually really impressed with Tucker Carlson's journalism at the very end there. So he did a really good job of representing the argument against military interventionism. Everything he said at the end there was 100% factually correct. What I don't like about this segment is that Tucker Carlson has failed to criticize Donald Trump for not actually following through with pulling out of Syria and with pulling out of Afghanistan. Understand this, that one of Donald Trump's promises was to pull us out of Afghanistan immediately. No questions asked. And what really sucks is that never happened. And he actually threatened to do it. And then he caved to his military interventionist cabinet, who suggested, let's stay there because this really helps the military-industrial complex, which will help you get reelected. And so Donald Trump fell for that, and he decided to stay in Syria and Afghanistan despite there being an end goal. And the common reason for why we're there is because we need to fulfill a mission. And that if we pull out, it will be incredibly disorganized and everything will go, all chaos will break through, and then everything's just going to go crazy and insane. But the problem with that theory is that, I mean, consider one of the first wars where Americans just absolutely despised U.S. military intervention, and that was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had to end with us just completely pulling out. And so many people would suggest, well, if we pull out, then, we're not going to be able to fulfill our mission, and all of those soldiers will have had died in vain. But the problem with that argument is that by staying in there, you are suggesting that many more soldiers should die in vain. We shouldn't have been in there in the first place. And so for that same logical reason, we shouldn't be in Afghanistan. We shouldn't be in 168 countries or whatever it was, right? That it doesn't make sense. So Tucker Carlson is absolutely correct. And I'm incredibly surprised that he talked about this. I just wish he would bag on Trump a little bit more. Now, he is doing this to justify sending troops to the southern border. I oppose that, but understand this. Here's my take. If Donald Trump can bring soldiers to the southern border and we could get out of all of the countries that we're involved in right now for absolutely no reason for the most part, just staying there just in case, we can basically topple the government with a coup. If we can negotiate, I'm willing to negotiate that. Like, if you think that there's some sort of crisis at the southern border, get out of all the wars, and I will certainly agree with that. I would much rather just pull out. I'd much rather vote for someone who is against military interventionism, like Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, not Elizabeth Warren. Don't even get me started. But anyways, I'd be willing to negotiate nonetheless, because this is one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now. We're giving over $100 billion, technically it's I think like $17 billion or something like that, in arms to Saudi Arabia, who is owned by a dictatorship. Not an election, not a democracy, but we support dictatorships. In fact, overall, we support 73% of dictatorships. That's like, so whoever you believe about our government, like Democrat or Republican, you should understand that both the establishment Democrats, the establishment Republicans, including Donald Trump, are in favor of still supporting 73% of the dictatorships. And so when we're giving a bunch of arms to Saudi Arabia, don't be surprised when all of a sudden you have all Al-Qaeda and, well, maybe not necessarily Al-Qaeda, but, well, actually, yeah, probably Al-Qaeda, a bunch of terrorist groups with AK-47s that we built as the U.S. country. Like, I could go on and on about this, but understand that what Tucker Carlson is doing here, I completely support. I'm actually kind of proud of him for doing that. He said at the very beginning, though, that something that was incredibly factually incorrect. He said, whenever there is a consensus, run. I don't necessarily agree with that. So, for example, universal background checks. 92% of Americans want it. Now, is there a consensus in Congress? No. But why? It's because we have money in politics. Now, if we didn't have money in politics, if we have money in politics, for the most part, I would agree that if there is a consensus, yes, run. I do completely agree with that kind of concept. Typically, that tends to be the case. If we got money out of politics, I would actually argue that when you have a consensus, run for the consensus, because then you actually have a representative democracy, which I'm not even in favor of. I'm in favor of direct democracy, as many of you guys know. But I mean, if the country wants the policies, then support the policies. That being said, however, like what I don't like about what Tucker Carlson was saying in the beginning is he was saying that everyone in Congress has developed this consensus that there is no crisis at the southern border. What? That's a consensus? You're telling me that the Democrats and the Republicans have a consensus that there's no crisis at the southern border? Yeah, I don't think that's what they're suggesting. I think that Congress has decided that Trump cannot declare a national emergency. Do I think there's a consensus around that? Absolutely not. I think that declaration passed by Congress that was vetoed by Donald Trump was hardly passed. It was hardly passed. And now the House Democrats were absolutely in favor. The Senate Democrats were absolutely in favor. There were only a very few number of Republicans that swayed on this issue. And we're talking like the most centrist, I should say, basically the Republicans that would that could pretty much be considered an establishment Democrat when you look at their agenda. So all of the women Republicans, which in the Senate, which is I think 2. No, that's not true. Kirsten Sinema voted against it, but it's beside the point. Like it's not a consensus. Like don't say it's a consensus unless it's a consensus. And the guy Tucker Carlson, he attacked this guy Max Boot for like no reason. Like he used this one person to justify that there is a consensus around this issue. Pump your brakes, dude. It's one guy. It's not. You can't call it a consensus if you're using one person. Your entire argument, Max Boot, Max Boot, Max Boot, and then like he said, but here's the thing: Max Boot can't talk about our crisis because he supports military intervention. I don't really understand that logic, but if you're correct, Tucker, that implies that we shouldn't be listening to Donald Trump because Donald Trump supports military interventionism. It's in his foreign policy. He supports military interventionism. By that same token, guys, literally, if you're going to criticize Max Boot for talking about this crisis and saying he has no room to talk about the crisis because he supports military interventionism, by the same token, Tucker, Donald Trump has no room to talk about military or talk about the southern border. Oh my gosh. Sometimes I don't think Tucker really reads his own scripts that he's reading off of the teleprompter, and he just kind of goes for it because whenever you see him off camera, he tends to have some sort of coherent argument that I disagree with, but at least it's somewhat coherent. This was a very incoherent segment, and I believe there was like 5 fifth graders that all decided to talk about reasons why we should have troops at the southern border, and then they copy pasted the segments side by side, and one of them was Max Boot, one of them was there's a consensus, and one of them was we're so many wars. What the heck is this? This is the most incoherent thing I ever. Sometimes I've done a segment, I don't know how many times, like probably every 3 days on Tucker Carlson being incoherent, and this is just one of the many.